The air is thick with smoke, the scent of burning crops clinging to your clothes as you peer over the wooden palisade. In the distance, the ominous clatter of armor and the shouts of armed men grow louder. This isn't just a bad day, it's your new reality. For medieval villagers living under siege, every sunrise brought the same terrifying question: would today be the day the walls fell? Survival wasn't just about bravery. It was a desperate game of wits, resourcefulness, and sheer stubbornness against overwhelming odds. These weren't knights or kings. They were ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen, who faced starvation, betrayal, and the constant threat of violence with nothing but their collective ingenuity to keep them alive. And somehow, against all logic, many of them outlasted armies that should have crushed them in days. How did they do it? Picture a world where a single loaf of bread could mean the difference between life and death, where children learned to spot enemy scouts before they could read, and where every well, every cellar, every scrap of land held a hidden purpose. Medieval villagers under siege didn't just endure, they adapted in ways that would astonish us today. They turned their homes into fortresses, their famine into strategy, and even their silence into a weapon. While history remembers the battles and the kings, the real story is how these communities outthought, outlasted, and sometimes even outmaneuvered their attackers. Their survival wasn't luck, it was an inhuman resilience. What's even more remarkable is how much their struggles mirror challenges we still face today. When resources run low, when threats loom large, human beings have always found ways to innovate under pressure. The lessons of these medieval villages aren't locked in the past, they're blueprints for perseverance. So let's step into their world, where every decision carried life or death stakes, and discover how ordinary people accomplished the extraordinary. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at a crumbling castle wall or an old grain storeroom the same way again. Their story is waiting, and it's more gripping than any legend. To understand why medieval villages were so vulnerable, you have to picture a world where security was a luxury few could afford. While castles rose high on hills with thick stone walls and deep moats, most villages had nothing more than a hastily built wooden fence or a simple ditch piled with dirt. These flimsy barriers might stop a wandering thief or a wild animal, but against a determined army, they were little more than a speed bump. And yet, these were the only shields standing between families and the horrors of a siege. Location played a cruel role in their fate. Villages didn't spring up randomly. They grew where the land was fertile, near rivers for water, or along well-traveled trade routes. These were the same spots raiders and armies coveted. A thriving village meant food, supplies, and often undefended wealth, making it a perfect target for anyone looking to weaken a region or feed their own troops. Unlike a castle, which could be stocked for months, a village's survival depended on the season's harvest. If attackers arrived just before the crops were gathered, the entire community faced starvation within weeks. But perhaps the most terrifying weakness was their lack of resources. Castles had deep wells, some descending hundreds of feet, ensuring water even during the driest sieges. Villagers relied on shallow streams or communal wells that could be poisoned or blocked in a matter of hours. Storage was just as dire. Where a castle's granaries could hold grain for a year, a village might only have enough to last a few weeks. When the siege dragged on, desperation set in fast. Families would eat anything, from boiled leather to rats, just to stay alive one more day. And yet, Knowing these vulnerabilities makes their resilience even more astonishing. They didn't have the advantages of kings or knights, just their wits, their community, and an unshakable will to survive. The very things that made them easy targets also forced them to adapt in ways no castle garrison ever had to. Their struggles weren't just about holding out. They were about rewriting the rules of survival under impossible odds. When hunger became the deadliest enemy, medieval villagers fought back with cunning rather than swords. Their most powerful weapon wasn't hidden in a barn or a cellar. It was buried right under the feet of their enemies. Across Europe, from England to the Balkans, communities developed elaborate systems of secret food storage that turned their very soil into a lifeline. These weren't just hiding spots, they were masterpieces of deception. Imagine a raider bursting into a village, overturning sacks in the granary, only to find them filled with straw or rocks, while the real treasure, enough grain to feed 100 people, lay sealed in watertight clay pots beneath an unmarked patch of earth outside the blacksmith's forge. The science behind these hidden caches was as precise as it was desperate. Villagers learned to dig pits deep enough to avoid detection, but shallow enough to retrieve food quickly when danger passed. They lined them with straw, ash, or even sheep's wool to absorb moisture, keeping grain edible for years. Some communities went further, creating false-bottomed storage buildings where the upper level held just enough supplies to satisfy raiders, while the real bounty sat concealed below. The most ingenious systems involved spreading small caches throughout the village. A basket of oats behind a loose hearthstone here, a clay jar of dried beans beneath the church altar there. So even if one was discovered, the community wouldn't starve. But the true brilliance lay in the human element. Knowledge of these hiding places became a sacred trust, passed in whispers from one generation of elders to the next. Children might play over buried grain pits for years without knowing what lay beneath them. In some villages, only 3 people, often the priest, the miller, and the oldest widow, knew every location. This secrecy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. When captured villagers faced torture, they genuinely couldn't reveal what they didn't know. And when invaders demanded tribute, communities could surrender visible stores while secretly preserving enough to outlast the siege. What's astonishing is how these methods mirrored military strategy. Like generals disguising troop movements, villagers used decoys and misinformation. They'd let word slip about a secret cellar filled with rotting vegetables, while the real stores sat undisturbed. Some even staged fake arguments over worthless caches to mislead spies. This wasn't just hiding, it was psychological warfare fought with loaves of bread and sacks of barley. The legacy of these tactics still echoes today. Modern disaster preparedness guides still recommend dispersed food storage, and the principle of "don't keep all your eggs in one basket" traces straight back to these medieval survivors. Their ingenuity reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet, desperate creativity of ordinary people determined to see another harvest. If you think modern communities are tight-knit, medieval villagers under siege took cooperation to an entirely different level. Survival wasn't just about individual strength. It demanded a level of unity that would put even the most organized societies to shame. Every pair of hands, every scrap of food, every ounce of energy became part of a shared lifeline. The moment danger appeared on the horizon, petty squabbles vanished. Neighbors who'd argued over fence lines or grazing rights suddenly became a single organism, moving with precision to protect what little they had left. Take food distribution, for example. Unlike castles with strict military hierarchies, villages operated on trust. A council of elders, often including women, whose knowledge of household resources was invaluable, would oversee rationing with meticulous fairness. Each family received portions based on need, not status. A blacksmith's extra bread might go to a weaver with hungry children, while the weaver's repaired clothes kept the blacksmith's family warm. This reciprocity wasn't charity, it was survival mathematics. Hoarding meant chaos, and chaos meant death. Guard duty became another exercise in collective sacrifice. While knights in castles rotated shifts with military discipline, villagers had no professional soldiers. Instead, fathers, grandmothers, and even teenagers took turns watching the walls. The frail and elderly cooked or tended fires so the strong could stand watch. Children as young as 6 were taught to recognize alarm signals, a specific bird call, a pattern of torch flickers, so they could rouse the household without alerting enemies. This wasn't just practicality. It wove every villager into the fabric of defense, giving even the weakest a role to play. Perhaps most touching was the care of children. When parents fell ill or died, others absorbed their young without hesitation. Orphan children weren't burdens. They were extra hands to grind grain or tend livestock. Communities even developed silent signals, a particular stitch in a child's clothing, a mark on a doorframe, to indicate which homes could shelter the displaced if attackers breached the walls. This web of mutual aid meant no child was ever truly alone, even in the darkest hours. The psychological impact of this unity can't be overstated. While isolated castle garrisons often fractured under stress, villages drew strength from their bonds. Shared hardship became shared purpose. Stories from the time describe besieged communities singing together at night to keep spirits up or inventing covert communication methods, like tapping rhythms on water pipes to coordinate without words. Their cooperation wasn't just practical, it was the glue that held their sanity together. What's remarkable is how these medieval strategies mirror modern disaster response. From hurricane shelters to pandemic mutual aid groups, we still rely on many of the same principles. Those villagers understood something we often forget. Against overwhelming odds, the only real advantage is each other. Their legacy isn't just in the walls they defended, but in the unbreakable human connections they forged under fire. The most powerful weapon in a medieval village wasn't always steel or stone. Sometimes, it was pure illusion. When facing armies that could crush them in hours, villagers turned to psychological warfare so clever it would make modern strategists pause. Imagine being an attacking soldier, creeping toward a village at dawn, only to see dozens of armed sentries silhouetted against the watchtowers. Your heart pounds, until you realize too late those aren't men at all, but straw-stuffed dummies dressed in spare helmets and cloaks, their hollow eyes staring blankly through the morning mist. This theater of deception went far beyond scarecrows. Villagers mastered the art of making the mundane terrifying. Empty pots clattered over fires at night, sending the scent of non-existent stews drifting toward enemy camps. Children practiced exaggerated laughter and singing to mimic the sounds of a well-fed community. Some villages even staged elaborate pantomimes, Women would pretend to knead invisible dough. Men sharpened sticks as if they were swords, all visible to scouts through gaps in the palisade. The message was clear. We're not desperate, we're prepared. Timing these illusions became its own deadly science. Villagers knew attackers watched for signs of weakness, smoke thinning from chimneys, silence replacing the usual clamor of life. So they flipped the script. On days when hunger bit deepest, they'd deliberately hang laundry as if celebrating a feast. When their last goat was slaughtered, boys would parade through the streets with sticks carved like drumsticks, licking their lips theatrically. These weren't just tricks. They were carefully crafted performances designed to plant doubt in an invader's mind. The psychological toll on besiegers was very real. Historical accounts describe frustrated commanders waiting weeks to attack what they believed were well-supplied strongholds, only to find starving skeletons behind the walls. Some villages took deception further, spreading rumors through captured spies about mythical stockpiles, or invented alliances with nearby lords. One chronicle tells of a village that staged a fake wedding feast using stolen enemy banners as tablecloths, convincing the attackers their own allies had betrayed them. What's most striking is how these tactics reveal medieval villagers' deep understanding of human nature. They knew fear thrives on uncertainty, that hesitation could be more lethal than any arrow. While castles relied on thick walls, villagers built fortresses in their enemies' minds. Their greatest strength wasn't what they had, but what they made others believe they had. In the end, survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about convincing the world you couldn't be broken. When walls and weapons failed, medieval villagers turned to the earth itself for salvation. Hidden beneath the straw-strewn floors of cottages, or concealed behind false walls in root cellars, lay networks of tunnels, so secret that even some villagers lived their entire lives unaware of their existence. These weren't crude holes in the ground. They were feats of desperate engineering, some stretching hundreds of yards to distant forests or riverbanks. The most sophisticated systems included ventilation shafts disguised as rotting fence posts and underwater exits masked by reeds, allowing entire families to vanish like ghosts when raiders stormed the gates. The construction of these tunnels reveals astonishing ingenuity. Without architects or blueprints, villagers relied on generations of accumulated wisdom. Some passages followed natural limestone cavities, while others were painstakingly carved with stolen iron tools over years of nighttime digging. The narrowest tunnels, barely wider than a child's shoulders, served a chilling purpose. When adults couldn't risk being spotted outside, children became invisible couriers, wriggling through darkness to deliver messages to neighboring villages or retrieve hidden caches of food. Escape routes doubled as psychological weapons. There are accounts of besiegers watching in frustration as smoke continued rising from chimneys days after supposedly cutting off a village, unaware that supplies were being smuggled through tunnels beneath their feet. Some communities took deception further, letting attackers discover fake escape routes that led to dead ends or traps, while the real passages remained hidden under innocent-looking sheep pens or compost heaps. The true brilliance lay in how these tunnels transformed weakness into strength. A village with no standing army could suddenly strike back by smuggling in allies or launching surprise raids through underground networks. During one famous siege in the 14th century, villagers used a tunnel to infiltrate the enemy camp at night, not to attack, but to steal back their own stolen livestock under the noses of sleeping guards. These hidden passageways did more than save lives. They preserved hope. Even when fire consumed the thatched roofs and enemy flags flew over the smoldering remains, the knowledge of unseen tunnels meant no defeat was truly final. Some surviving sketches from the period show tunnels marked with symbols only certain families could interpret, proving how deeply secrecy was woven into village life. Modern archaeologists still stumble upon these ancient escape routes, often finding them exactly as they were left. A child's small shoe here, a rusted lantern there, silent witnesses to the invisible war fought beneath the feet of history's conquerors. The lesson is clear. When all seems lost, sometimes the bravest act isn't standing your ground, but knowing when and how to disappear. While invaders saw only untamed wilderness, medieval villagers looked at the same forests and fields and saw a hidden grocery store, pharmacy, and toolbox all in one. Their ability to read the landscape like a living encyclopedia kept entire communities alive when granaries ran empty. Unlike castle garrisons that relied on stockpiled goods, villagers tapped into knowledge passed down through generations: which plants could kill you, which could save you, and how to transform something as simple as acorns into life-sustaining flower. Take something as humble as tree bark. To outsiders, it was just rough covering on oaks and pines. But to a starving village, the inner layer of certain barks could be pounded into flour when mixed with ground nettles. Willow bark became pain relief tea, while birch sap collected in early spring provided precious sugars. Children learned to spot the telltale shapes of edible mushrooms before they could write their names, and grandmothers carried mental maps of every berry patch and wild onion cluster within a day's walk. This wasn't casual foraging. It was a precise science of survival. The true genius lay in their multisensory approach to identification. Villagers didn't just memorize what plants looked like. They knew how they smelled when crushed, how they tasted at different seasons, even how their roots sounded when pulled from certain soils. A single misstep could mean poison, so training began early. Mothers taught toddlers rhymes that encoded plant wisdom: white berries, deadly fright, red with thorns. Take them home, turning life or death lessons into simple songs. Medicinal knowledge proved equally vital. When wounds festered and no doctor could reach the besieged village, yarrow leaves staunched bleeding, plantain poultices drew out infection, and fermented honey became an antiseptic. Some communities cultivated hidden, healing gardens near burial grounds, knowing raiders would avoid those areas. The line between food and medicine blurred entirely. Dandelion roots roasted as coffee substitutes also cleansed livers, while pine needle tea warded off scurvy during endless winters. Perhaps most impressive was their adaptation to scarcity. As familiar plants were stripped bare, villagers innovated. They discovered that soaking bitter acorns in running water for days removed their toxins, creating a protein-rich flour. Nettles, painful to touch, became nutritious soup when boiled. Even seemingly useless materials had purpose. Lichen could be boiled into gelatinous broth, while certain mosses lined shoes to prevent frostbite. Nothing was wasted. Survival demanded seeing potential where others saw only desperation. This intimate environmental knowledge gave villagers an edge no army could replicate. While soldiers starved waiting for supply carts, locals slipped past enemy lines to harvest cattail roots from marshes or collect snails from riverbanks. Some chronicles describe villagers deliberately leaving patches of weeds untouched near their walls, not from neglect, but because those weeds were emergency food reserves in disguise. Their greatest defense wasn't just what they knew, but how invisibly they wielded that knowledge, turning the very land against their oppressors. The legacy of this wisdom still echoes today. Modern survival experts study medieval foraging techniques, and many rediscovered herbal remedies were common knowledge in besieged villages. Their story reminds us that true resourcefulness isn't about having abundance. It's about understanding the world deeply enough to find nourishment where others see only emptiness. When the wooden gates trembled under siege weapons, and the night echoed with distant war cries, medieval villagers turned to something far older than swords or walls: their faith. Religion wasn't just Sunday devotion. It became the invisible armor that kept communities from crumbling under fear. Picture this: a line of exhausted villagers shuffling through muddy streets at dawn, clutching flickering candles, as they chant prayers to saints long dead. To outsiders, it might look like superstition. But in that moment, every whispered word was a lifeline, a way to transform terror into something bearable. Churches and shrines became command centers of hope. While castles had armories, villages had relics: fragments of bone said to belong to martyrs, scraps of cloth touched by holy figures, even vials of dirt from sacred sites. These objects weren't just symbols, they were psychological weapons. Villagers would parade them along the walls when scouts were spotted, their presence alone sometimes enough to give attackers pause. There are accounts of besieging armies hesitating for days after seeing a village's treasured icon displayed defiantly atop the gates, as if divine wrath might strike anyone who advanced. Rituals provided something even more crucial: rhythm in chaos. Daily prayers marked time when calendars blurred together. Special masses held during attacks weren't just pleas for mercy, they were acts of defiance. In one besieged French village, women would gather at the church every evening to sing hymns loud enough to drown out the enemy's taunts. The sound, drifting over the walls, reportedly unnerved attackers more than arrows. But faith's real power lay in its ability to bind communities than any rope. Shared rituals created invisible threads between neighbors. A family breaking their last loaf of bread for the Eucharist wasn't just observing tradition. They were reaffirming that no one would starve alone. When supplies ran low, villages often held miraculous feasts, communal meals where meager rations were blessed and distributed, transforming scraps into sacred sustenance. The mind could endure far more when convinced heaven was watching. Some practices walked the line between devotion and cunning. A village under siege might suddenly display a mysterious new relic, perhaps an old sword suddenly declared to be a saint's blade, just as enemy morale wavered. Others staged elaborate divine signs, like arranging for a flock of birds to scatter over the enemy camp at the precise moment priests predicted divine intervention. These weren't just acts of faith. They were calculated displays meant to seed doubt in attackers' minds. The legacy of this spiritual resilience lingers in surprising ways. Modern psychology confirms what those villagers knew instinctively. Ritual reduces anxiety, and shared belief fosters endurance. Their candles and processions were medieval versions of stress relief techniques we still use today. When all else failed, faith gave them the one thing no siege could take: the unshakable conviction that survival wasn't just possible, but ordained. History remembers the sword-wielding defenders on the walls, but the real architects of survival often moved in silence. Women bending over concealed herb gardens, children scattering chicken feed to mask footprints in the dirt. While men clashed with invaders at the gates, an invisible network of resistance operated behind the scenes, turning domestic spaces into battlefields and everyday tasks into acts of defiance. A village's endurance didn't hinge on strength alone. It relied on the quiet, relentless labor of those who were told their role was to wait and worry. Water collection became a life-or-death ballet under moonlight. With wells guarded by enemies, women developed ingenious methods to outwit sentries. Some lowered buckets on ropes padded with cloth to mute the telltale splash. Others used hollowed reeds to siphon water from streams into hidden casks, drop by precious drop. In one besieged German village, legend tells of a group who disguised themselves as laundresses, filling their washtubs with water while openly singing, a performance so ordinary it masked their true mission. Even children played their part, their small hands perfect for slipping through gaps in the palisade to retrieve dew-soaked moss wrung into cooking pots. Hidden gardens flourished where no raider thought to look. Between cottage walls, beneath church pews, even in abandoned animal burrows, women cultivated patches of onions, leeks, and medicinal herbs. These weren't haphazard plots, but meticulously engineered survival systems. Fast-growing greens were staggered so a handful could be harvested daily without attracting notice. Poisonous plants like foxglove were grown alongside edibles, not for food, but as a last resort defense. Some women sowed seeds into the hems of their skirts, ensuring that even if forced to flee, they carried the means to begin again. Children mastered the art of distraction with chilling precision. A well-timed tantrum near the gates could draw guards away from a vulnerable section of wall. Groups of girls playing hopscotch might deliberately kick pebbles to mask the sound of men reinforcing barricades. In one account from the 100 Years' War, boys flying kites, fashioned from stolen enemy maps, distracted archers long enough for villagers to sabotage a siege engine. These weren't childish games, but rehearsed tactics passed down through generations like folk songs. Perhaps most crucially, women preserved knowledge that kept communities intact. While battles raged, they maintained oral records of food caches, tunnel entrances, and safe routes, information too dangerous to write down. Doubled as intelligence gatherers, using their freedom to move between households to coordinate resistance. Older women, often dismissed as harmless by invaders, became living libraries of survival techniques, from which mushrooms could ease hunger pains to how to extract salt from urine for preserving meat. The legacy of this silent resistance reshaped societies in unexpected ways. Surviving records show besieged villages granting women unprecedented authority in rationing and defense decisions, a temporary necessity that sometimes became permanent change. Their contributions prove that survival isn't just about who holds the weapon, but who remembers where the food is buried, who can improvise a bandage from tree bark, and who teaches the next generation to turn ordinary objects into tools of defiance. When the siege lifted, these women and children didn't receive medals or ballads, but without them, there would have been no one left to sing. The art of war isn't always fought with blades. Sometimes, the most devastating weapon is a well-placed lie. Medieval villagers mastered the delicate craft of misinformation, turning whispers and staged performances into shields stronger than oak. Imagine an enemy scout creeping close to the walls at dusk, only to hear raucous laughter and the clatter of dishes, a feast in full swing. What he couldn't see were the hollow bowls, the roast meat that was really carved turnips, the wine casks filled with muddy water. The village wasn't celebrating. It was performing a survival ritual as precise as any military maneuver. These deceptions weren't just random tricks. They followed careful psychology. Villagers knew invaders watched for signs of weakness, thinning smoke from chimneys, fewer voices in the night. So they flipped the script. When hunger bit deepest, children were sent to play loudly near the walls with bloated stomachs stuffed with grass to mimic fullness. Women would hang laundry in deliberate patterns, signaling to distant observers that life continued as normal. Some communities even staged fake funerals for empty coffins, knowing attackers would interpret mourning as a sign of dwindling numbers. The goal wasn't just to fool the enemy, but to weaponize their own expectations against them. Rumors became bullets fired across enemy lines. A captured villager might accidentally let slip that a neighboring lord's army was 3 days away, when in truth, no help was coming. Others spread tales of hidden stockpiles in nearby forests, sending raiders on wild goose chases while villagers reclaimed stolen supplies. The most cunning schemes involved double bluffs. A village might deliberately let a spy discover a fake tunnel, only to collapse it on invaders who tried to use it. These weren't lies for lies' sake. They were calculated disruptions of an enemy's decision-making, each falsehood buying precious hours for real defenses to strengthen. Some deceptions verged on theatrical genius. Chronicles describe villages rigging church bells to ring via hidden ropes after all able-bodied men had left to summon imaginary reinforcements. Others staged desertions, having villagers pretend to defect while secretly carrying poisoned food into enemy camps. One account tells of a besieged town that dressed scarecrows in armor and paraded them along the walls at dusk, convincing attackers they faced fresh troops instead of exhausted farmers. What's remarkable is how these tactics exploited very human vulnerabilities. Attackers expected desperation, so villages projected abundance. They anticipated silence, so villagers filled the air with noise. By controlling the narrative, these communities turned their greatest weakness, being watched, into a strength. Modern psychological operations in warfare still echo these medieval strategies, proving that sometimes the most enduring weapon isn't force, but the ability to make others believe in shadows. The moment attackers abandoned their camps, medieval villagers didn't just breathe a sigh of relief, they saw opportunity in the wreckage. Broken siege engines, left behind in the mud, became treasure troves for survivors who knew how to look. That massive battering ram splintered against the gates, firewood for a dozen families through winter, the twisted metal from a mangled catapult, hammers and plow blades in the making. Even the bodies of fallen soldiers were searched with grim efficiency. Boots stripped for leather, belt buckles melted down, scraps of armor reforged into cooking pots. In the aftermath of terror, nothing was too small or too macabre to be repurposed. This wasn't mere scavenging. It was urban warfare recycling at its most ingenious. Villagers developed specialized roles for post-siege recovery. Blacksmiths would lead teams to dismantle metal fittings, while woodcutters salvaged timber from siege towers, often reusing the same beams attackers had cut from nearby forests. Children collected arrowheads for reuse, and women unraveled enemy tent canvas to stitch into clothing. Even the rubble of collapsed walls found new life, crushed into mortar for repairs. Every object held latent potential. A single abandoned cart might yield nails, grease, and enough wood to rebuild a chicken coop, while the iron rings from a shattered shirt could be strung as makeshift fishing weights. The most valuable prizes were often the least obvious. Siege camps left behind tools, axes, shovels, even anvils, that villagers had lacked for generations. Some chronicles describe communities discovering enemy food stores buried to lighten retreat, turning a besieging army's own preparations into the village's salvation. In one remarkable case, a group of French peasants repurposed a damaged trebuchet's counterweight stones as the foundation for a new granary, inscribing each with the names of attackers who'd carried them there. Perhaps the darkest salvaging involved the dead. While modern sensibilities might recoil, medieval villagers saw practicality in extremity. Leather armor softened by rain could be cut into patching material for shoes. Broken swords became farm implements. Even human hair, meticulously collected, was woven into ropes or used to chink gaps in walls. This wasn't desecration. It was the stark arithmetic of survival. When every scrap mattered, sentimentality burned away like morning fog. The legacy of this ruthless efficiency lingers in unexpected places. Archaeologists still uncover siege sites where evidence shows villagers systematically dismantled equipment down to the last nail. What raiders intended as instruments of destruction became, in clever hands, the building blocks of renewal. These communities understood something profound. Survival isn't just about enduring the storm, but learning to sail with the wreckage. Animals weren't just property to medieval villagers. They were silent partners in survival, each with a role as vital as any human defender. When raiders approached, the first thing to vanish wasn't grain or tools, but the livestock. Entire herds would disappear into forests or be lowered into hidden cellar pits beneath barns, their muzzles bound with cloth to stifle telltale sounds. Cows, pigs, and goats weren't just future meals. They were walking seed banks, their milk and offspring ensuring a village could rebuild even if crops were torched. The bond between humans and animals in these crises went far beyond practicality. It was a pact of mutual desperation. Dogs became the unsung heroes of besieged villages. Unlike castle sentries who stood visible on walls, village dogs patrolled silently, trained to distinguish between the crunch of a deer's hoof and the tread of an armed man. Their warnings didn't come as frantic barking that would reveal positions, but as subtle cues. A paw scratch at a door, a low growl muffled against a shepherd's leg. Some communities bred specific lineages for siege work, selecting dogs with extra toes for climbing rubble or dark coats to blend into night patrols. Historical records from the Swiss Alps describe how a single mutt named Frost reportedly alerted his village to 12 separate nighttime attacks by tugging on a rope linked to hidden bells. Pigeons carried more than messages. They carried hope. Villagers maintained covert lofts in church steeples or hollow trees, their birds trained to fly only at certain moon phases to avoid hawks or archers. The real genius lay in their deception. A pigeon released during daylight might be a decoy, while the vital bird slipped out disguised as part of a fleeing flock of wild doves. Some messages were written in code, but others relied on the birds themselves. A pigeon returning with its leg band dyed red could mean, "Help is coming," while a missing feather signaled, "Prepare to flee." Even the smallest creatures played outsized roles. Cats weren't just mousers. Their movements helped villagers gauge enemy activity. A sudden absence of cats might mean poison had been scattered outside the walls, while their agitation could signal hidden tunnels being dug. Geese, with their razor-sharp night vision, were tethered near weak points in defenses, their honks more reliable than any human watch. Beekeepers would move hives near potential breach points. Knowing the chaos, a disturbed swarm could unleash on armored invaders. The most poignant stories involve animals as psychological bulwarks. Children tasked with feeding hidden livestock formed fierce attachments. One account tells of a girl who smuggled her favorite goat into a secret tunnel every night, singing to it to keep it calm. Elderly villagers who could no longer fight would spend hours brushing horses or whispering to chickens, not just to keep them productive, but to preserve some shred of normalcy. In a world where hunger blurred moral lines, these relationships reminded communities what they were fighting for, not just survival, but the right to someday hear cattle lowing in sunny pastures again. What's astonishing is how these medieval tactics foreshadowed modern warfare. From messenger dogs in the trenches of World War I to carrier pigeons earning medals for valor, the lessons of village ingenuity echo across centuries. Their approach reveals a truth we often forget. In the calculus of survival, every life, human or animal, holds value beyond measure. When the siege lifted and the fields were replanted, it wasn't just people who rebuilt. It was the bonds between species that had weathered the storm together. The test of a besieged village wasn't the clash of steel at the gates. It was the slow, gnawing emptiness that came when the last grain sack had been scraped clean. Hunger reshaped bodies and minds in ways no battle ever could. Ribs pressed against skin like barrel staves. Children's laughter gave way to listless silence, and the very air seemed to thicken with the scent of desperation. Yet in this abyss of starvation, medieval villagers displayed a resourcefulness that bordered on alchemy, transforming the inedible into sustenance through knowledge, passed down through generations of hardship. Leather became more than just armor or footwear. It became dinner. Villagers knew precisely which hides to choose. Vegetable-tanned belts and shoes could be boiled for days, yielding a bitter, gelatinous broth that at least filled hollow stomachs. The real skill lay in preparation. Women would scrape away the outer layers where toxins accumulated, then cut the remaining strips into tiny pieces to swell in water. Some accounts describe adding handfuls of wood ash to neutralize acids, creating a crude survival ration that staved off death a few more days. Even book bindings weren't spared. Parchment scraps flavored with wild garlic made a grim kind of soup. Then there were the creatures no one spoke of in times of plenty. Rats, normally reviled, became prized catches. Children learned to set traps using stolen enemy arrowheads, while elders remembered which cellar corners the plumpest rodents nested in. The trick was timing. Starving rats grew lean and dangerous, sometimes carrying diseases that could finish what hunger started. Villagers developed meticulous butchering methods, roasting the meat thoroughly and using every part. The tails became twine, the bones were ground into powder for thickening gruel, and the fat, precious beyond measure, was rendered down to grease squeaky gate hinges or coat throats raw from eating roughage. But the true measure of their ingenuity lay in the landscape itself. Meadows stripped bare by foraging armies still hid nourishment if you knew how to look. Grass wasn't just chewed raw, it was fermented in sealed pits to break down cellulose, creating a vile but vitamin-rich paste. Acorns, after weeks of leaching in running water, could be pounded into flour. Even pine bark, shaved thin and boiled with nettles, provided trace minerals to keep muscles from seizing. The knowledge of which plants could kill versus which could sustain often meant the difference between a village that survived and one that became another cautionary tale. Disease stalked malnutrition like a shadow. Scurvy turned gums to spongy masses that bled at a touch, while pellagra brought hallucinations of banquets that didn't exist. The irony: starving bodies became terrible sentinels. Guards collapsed at their posts, their swollen tongues making it impossible to sound alarms. Mothers rationed their own saliva to moisten their babies' mouths. Yet even here, villagers adapted, rotating watch duties to those still strong enough to stand, brewing medicinal teas from mold scraped off cellar walls, and using honey stolen from wild hives to dress wounds that otherwise wouldn't heal. What's most haunting isn't the suffering, but the moments of grace that persisted. Elders would pretend to eat so children could have their portions. Neighbors shared single eggs like sacred relics, each family taking a spoonful of the beaten mixture. Some villages held feasts where families brought empty bowls to long tables, telling stories of better times as if the mere act of remembering could nourish. These weren't just acts of survival. They were declarations that even in the depths of despair, humanity could endure. The lesson etched into these grim chapters isn't about hunger itself, but about the extraordinary lengths ordinary people will go to protect one another. When archaeologists uncover siege layers with chewed leather fragments or rodent bones split for marrow, they're not just finding evidence of desperation. They're uncovering testaments to the indomitable will that kept civilizations alive through history's darkest winters. Water scarcity crept through besieged villages like an invisible executioner, far deadlier than any sword. While food shortages brought agony over weeks, contaminated water could empty a village in days. Dysentery and cholera didn't care about strong arms or brave hearts. They struck down warriors and children alike with equal indifference. The true horror wasn't just thirst, but the impossible choices it forced. Do you drink from the pond where corpses float, or gamble on the murky puddle near the latrines? Survival hinged on water management, so precise it bordered on sacred ritual. The most desperate villages became hydrological engineers overnight. Some dug blind wells beneath floorboards, their narrow shafts disguised as structural supports. Others funneled rainwater through hollowed-out logs into hidden cisterns, filtering it through layers of charcoal and sand. In regions with heavy morning dew, women would rise before dawn to sweep cloths across grasses, wringing each precious drop into clay jars. The technique was ancient. Roman soldiers used it, but medieval villagers perfected it, sometimes collecting enough to sustain a family for days. Contamination posed a constant nightmare. A single rotting carcass upstream could doom an entire community. Villagers developed crude but effective tests, dropping a silver ring into water to check for tarnish, or observing if fish survived in stored barrels. Some chronicles describe water councils of elders who decided which sources were safest, their decisions enforced with grim severity. Punishment for stealing from the communal reserve wasn't just about fairness, it was collective survival. The real innovation lay in deception. Wells were left conspicuously dry, while secret ones operated under churches or midden heaps. One account tells of a village that diverted a small spring through a buried pipe system, its outlets hidden inside hollow tree trunks. When attackers poisoned the main well, they assumed victory was imminent, never suspecting villagers were drawing clean water just paces away. Others staged elaborate ruses, letting enemies capture empty reservoirs while the real supply flowed through repurposed irrigation channels. Animals played unexpected roles in water security. Dogs were trained to locate hidden springs by scent, while chickens pecking at damp ground revealed potential digging sites. Some communities kept frogs in cisterns. If the frogs died, the water was suspect. Even insects became allies. Villagers watched where bees clustered to find seeping groundwater. What's most striking is how these struggles reshaped social structures. Water rights temporarily erased class divisions. The miller's daughter carried the same ration as the blacksmith's son. Women, traditionally excluded from defense planning, often took charge of distribution due to their expertise in household management. The psychological toll was profound. Thirst drove some to madness, while others found resilience they never knew they possessed. Modern disaster response still echoes these medieval lessons. From hurricane zones to war-torn cities, the principles remain unchanged. Protect your water, purify creatively, and never let your enemy know how desperate you truly are. Those villagers understood something we often forget. Civilization isn't built on gold or grain, but on the humble, irreplaceable molecule that keeps the human machine running. When the last drop is gone, so too is hope. Disease slithered through besieged villages like a thief in the night, striking down the strong and weak alike without discrimination. While warriors could brace against swords and arrows, no shield could block the invisible killers lurking in contaminated water, crowded shelters, and the very air they breathed. Typhus spread through lice-infested clothing, dysentery festered in tainted wells, and plague crept in with rats that outsmarted even the most vigilant guards. In these cramped quarters where families huddled together for warmth and safety, every cough became a potential death sentence, every feverish brow a reason for terrified whispers. Yet medieval villagers weren't helpless against this invisible onslaught. Their herbal knowledge, passed down through generations of trial and tragedy, became a lifeline. Women brewed teas from yarrow and elderflower to break fevers, while poultices of crushed garlic and honey were applied to wounds to ward off infection. Some communities cultivated plague gardens just outside the walls, patches of wormwood, mint, and other pungent herbs believed to purify the air. The most desperate measures showed astonishing foresight. In one besieged town, families burned juniper branches daily, not knowing the smoke contained compounds that actually killed airborne bacteria. Isolation tactics, crude but effective, slowed the tide of death. At the first sign of illness, victims were moved to sick huts at the village edge, often repurposed animal shelters with blankets hung for warmth. The healthy avoided these places with superstitious dread, leaving care to those who'd already survived the sickness. Gravediggers wore cloaks soaked in vinegar, and some villages even developed a primitive form of contact, tracing by marking houses, with infected residents using charcoal symbols on the door. The makeshift hospitals that emerged were scenes of both horror and hope. Church pews became beds, altar cloths were torn into bandages, and the few literate members out herbal recipes by candlelight. With no doctors, elderly women and even children took on nursing roles, spooning broth into the delirious and covering corpses with lime to prevent further spread. Some accounts describe entire villages where the only physicians were teenage girls who'd memorized herb lore from their grandmothers. What's most striking is how these desperate measures often outpaced official medical knowledge of the time. While royal physicians bled patients with leeches, villagers were using mold scraped from bread to dress wounds, centuries before penicillin's discovery. Their understanding of contagion, though wrapped in folk beliefs, led to practices we'd now call quarantine. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, it was often remote villages with strict isolation rules that inexplicably survived. The legacy of this grim ingenuity lingers in modern medicine's foundations. Social distancing, herbal antivirals, even the concept of field hospitals, all were refined in these desperate sieges. Those villagers fighting invisible enemies with garlic and vinegar were pioneers in their own right, proving that sometimes survival isn't about strength, but about the quiet, stubborn refusal to surrender to the unseen. The weight of perpetual fear pressed down on medieval villagers like an unseen yoke, bending spirits as surely as starvation bent bodies. Every creak of the gate, every distant shout carried the potential for fresh horror. Would this be the day the walls fell? Would tonight bring another funeral for a child too weak to cry? Unlike soldiers who faced battle in bursts of adrenaline, villagers endured a grinding, unrelenting dread that seeped into their bones over months or even years. Sleep became itself, with nightmares of flames and invaders mingling with the real sounds of enemy drums in the distance. Yet in this darkness, villagers kindled fragile lights of hope. Storytelling transformed from evening entertainment to psychological lifeline. Grandparents would recount tales not of knights and dragons, but of ancestors who'd survived past sieges, ordinary people who'd outlasted starvation through sheer stubbornness. These weren't just stories, they were blueprints for endurance. Children learned to measure time not by calendars, but by the progression of narratives that happened before the miller told us about the winter the river froze solid. The very act of gathering to listen rebuilt, shattered community bonds, reminding everyone they weren't suffering alone. Music became another weapon against despair. Simple instruments, a carved wooden flute, a stretched sheepskin drum, took on sacred significance. Villagers developed coded songs where cheerful melodies carried secret messages about food caches or enemy movements. Lullabies soothed frightened children while simultaneously teaching survival skills through rhymes. Hush now, dig deep. The nettles grow sweet where the stream turns east. Some besieged communities even sang work songs during night repairs, their harmonies deliberately off-key to mask the sounds of hammers on wood from enemy sentries. Rituals provided anchors in the storm. A village might hold weekly, memory feasts where families shared descriptions of favorite meals from better times, their words painting visions of roast goose and honey cakes that momentarily eclipsed the taste of boiled bark. Others staged symbolic battles, with children driving straw effigies of invaders from the gates with sticks, a psychological release that transformed helplessness into catharsis. The church played a dual role, offering both spiritual solace and practical routine. Daily prayers gave structure to endless, terror-filled days. The most profound coping mechanism was the villagers' ability to find meaning in suffering. They reframed their ordeal as a test of character, a trial that would prove their community's worth. Small acts of kindness, a widow sharing her last pinch of salt, a blacksmith mending a child's broken toy with scrap metal, became rebellions against dehumanization. This wasn't naive optimism. It was a calculated strategy for preserving sanity. When chroniclers later wrote of villages that survived against impossible odds, they often marveled not at their physical endurance, but at their refusal to let fear extinguish their humanity. Modern psychology confirms what these medieval villagers knew instinctively. Trauma shrinks in the face of shared purpose. Their rituals and stories functioned like ancient versions of group therapy, mitigating the effects of prolonged stress. The lesson echoes through time. When catastrophe strikes, the mind needs nourishment as desperately as the body. Those besieged villagers left us more than survival tactics. They left a testament to the indomitable human spirit that can find light even in history's darkest rooms. The clash between medieval siege engines and village defenses was like watching a wolf stalk a cornered rabbit, terrifyingly one-sided in theory, yet sometimes surprising in practice. When a trebuchet's first boulder smashed through a thatched roof, or a battering ram's rhythmic thuds shook the gate, villagers didn't just cower. They turned their poverty into ingenuity. Boiling oil was a luxury few could afford, but scalding water mixed with crushed lime became a vicious alternative, seeping through armor seams to burn skin. Archers weren't professional soldiers, but farmers who'd spent a lifetime hunting game, their arrows tipped with smithy scraps or even hardened animal bones. Every tool in the village became a potential weapon. Scythe blades lashed to poles became makeshift halberds. Fishing nets were repurposed to tangle attackers' legs. And even children's slingshots found new purpose hurling stones dipped in rotting manure to infect wounds. Against towering siege towers, villagers dug hidden trenches just beyond the walls, shallow enough to escape notice until the first wheels splintered in the dark. Battering rams met not just barred gates, but counterweights rigged from millstones that crashed down when ropes were cut. One account describes a German village suspending cauldrons of burning pitch from the gatehouse ceiling, releasing them at the precise moment the ram crew paused to catch their breath. The real brilliance lay in misdirection. A seemingly abandoned section of wall might conceal a platform of loose logs, collapsing under the weight of climbing soldiers. Even the humble village well became a trap. Some were deliberately left uncovered to lure thirsty invaders into deep, slick-sided pits. Trebuchets posed a unique nightmare. Villagers couldn't outrange these monstrous catapults, so they learned to read their rhythm. After counting the creaks of winding mechanisms, whole families would evacuate targeted buildings minutes before impact. Others used the enemy's ammunition against them, collecting spent stones to reinforce their own barricades or even carve into grinding wheels. The most desperate trick. A besieged French community once stuffed their granary with rags and straw, letting attackers destroy it in a fiery spectacle, while the real grain sat safely buried beneath the blacksmith's anvil. What's astonishing isn't that these defenses often failed, it's that they worked at all. Against professional armies with unlimited resources, villagers turned their every weakness into a fleeting advantage. A collapsed wall became a killing zone of broken pottery shards. The same narrow streets that funneled invaders could be rigged with falling timbers. Even livestock played a role. Goats released through hidden gaps would panic siege crews by darting underfoot, their bells creating auditory chaos. These weren't battles won by strength, but by a kind of brutal creativity that still resonates in modern guerrilla warfare. The lesson written in splintered gates and bloodied scythes is clear. When survival hangs by a thread, even the crudest tools can become instruments of defiance. Those villagers understood something profound. Against overwhelming force, the best defense isn't always armor, but the willingness to turn your enemy's momentum against them. Their legacy lives on wherever they refuse to surrender, proving that sometimes the weakest walls are defended by the strongest wills. The relationship between medieval villagers and their local lords during sieges walked a knife's edge between salvation and betrayal. When smoke appeared on the horizon, every eye turned not just toward the threat, but toward the castle on the hill. Would the lord who demanded their grain and labor now honor his oath of protection? The answer could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. Some lords proved their worth in iron and blood. Records from Normandy describe a baron who emptied his own granaries to feed besieged tenants, sending armed patrols to escort supply carts through enemy lines. In the Swiss Alps, a minor noble famously ordered his knights to fight disguised as villagers, blending into the community to ambush attackers from within. These weren't just acts of charity, they were calculated investments. A lord who protected his people preserved the workforce that maintained his wealth. The nobles understood that villages weren't just collections of huts, but the living engines of their power. Yet for every loyal lord, there were a dozen who barred their castle gates. As villages burned, aristocrats often prioritized protecting their personal stores over aiding subjects. Some even demanded double rents from desperate survivors, exploiting their vulnerability. The worst cases read like horror stories, like the Italian count who used his peasants as human shields, forcing them to stand on the walls while his own soldiers retreated to the keep. These betrayals didn't just cost lives, they shattered the feudal contract forever. The psychological impact of abandonment ran deep. Villagers who'd spent generations believing in the natural order of nobility's protection now saw the truth. Their lives were bargaining chips. In parts of France, entire communities later rebelled, tearing down the abandoned castles that had failed them. Other villages developed secret contingency plans, like the English hamlet that dug escape tunnels bypassing the Lord's fortress entirely. The message was clear. If nobility wouldn't honor its duties, neither would the peasantry. What's fascinating is how these crises exposed feudalism's fragile fiction. A system built on mutual obligation crumbled when tested. Some lords learned this too late, like the German knight who returned after a siege to find his villagers had secretly relocated, leaving only a mocking straw effigy in his throne. The lesson etched into these conflicts was simple: loyalty flows both ways. Those who forgot it often ruled over ashes and ghosts. The final act of a siege was never clean. It was a messy, desperate scramble where hope and hunger wrestled for dominance. Relief armies might appear as distant banners on the horizon, sending attackers fleeing in panic. Or a village might wake to find the enemy camp abandoned, nothing left but trampled earth and the stench of latrine pits. But just as often, surrender came through exhausted negotiation, with hollow-cheeked elders offering meager tribute in exchange for their lives. The terms were rarely generous. Sometimes it meant handing over every scrap of metal, every last goat, or even their children as hostages. Yet even this bitter pill was swallowed if it meant seeing another sunrise. Timing dictated survival as much as strength. A village that held out until the first frost might watch an invading army dissolve, its mercenaries refusing to camp in winter mud. Others survived because their attackers ran out of patience. Lords called their men home to harvest fields, or rival threats pulled armies away. The irony: some villages starved into surrender just days before relief arrived, their emaciated defenders collapsing as friendly troops marched through the gates. Rebuilding began before the ashes cooled. Survivors combed through wreckage with the precision of archaeologists, not just for usable tools or unburned grain, but for fragments of their old lives. A cracked loom shuttle, a half-melted cooking pot, a child's wooden doll blackened by fire but still recognizable. These weren't just objects, they were anchors to a world before the siege. The human cost lingered longest. Villages that lost too many hands faced collapse even after liberation. Fields went untended because the farmers were dead, roofs unrepaired because the carpenters hadn't survived the winter. Some communities resorted to bride fairs, inviting outsiders to marry widows and orphans just to replenish their numbers. The psychological scars ran deeper. Parents who'd eaten rats to save bread for their children, elders who'd chosen which families got the last handful of grain. These choices haunted survivors long after their bellies were full again. Yet in this wreckage, resilience took root. Villagers replanted orchards knowing they wouldn't live to taste the fruit. They rebuilt walls thicker, hiding escape tunnels beneath new. Most remarkably, they often chose to stay to whisper the names of the dead into the same soil that would feed there. Their endurance wasn't about forgetting the siege, but about refusing to let it be the last chapter. When scribes later wrote of villages rising from ashes, they missed the true miracle. Not the reconstruction of houses, but the rebirth of trust between people who'd seen each other at their worst and still chose to face the future together. The siege wasn't just a battle. It was in how ordinary people could outthink an empire. In 1209, when a crusading army surrounded the walls, they expected a quick surrender. What they got instead was a lesson in village ingenuity that would echo through the centuries. The defenders had no royal army, no stockpile of weapons, and no illusions about their chances. But what they lacked in steel, they made up for in sheer, stubborn creativity. Take their water supply, a vulnerability most villages couldn't overcome. Residents didn't just rely on their wells, they turned the entire landscape into a deception. While attackers camped by the river, smugly cutting off access, villagers were drawing water from hidden underground channels fed by natural springs. These weren't accidental features, but ancient Roman-era conduits the community had maintained for generations. Their existence kept secret even from most locals. When spies reported the wells running dry, the invaders celebrated prematurely, unaware that mothers were still bathing children and blacksmiths, quenching red-hot metal just out of sight. Food became another theater of psychological warfare. As supplies dwindled, the villagers staged elaborate performances. They'd toss half-rotted cabbages over the walls at night, letting them splatter near enemy sentries to simulate spoiled provisions. By day, children pretended to fight over imaginary crusts of bread in full view of scouts. The most brilliant stroke. Butchering their last scrawny goat with great ceremony, then hanging its inflated bladder from the gatehouse, a grisly flag signaling they still had meat to spare. The message was clear: we're not starving, we're feasting. Their defensive tricks were even more audacious. With no molten pitch to pour, they boiled laundry water mixed with quicklime, creating a caustic spray that blinded attackers scaling the walls. Archers fashioned arrows from shattered pottery, their jagged edges tearing through gaps in armor. When the enemy built siege towers, villagers waited until dark, then slipped out to smear the structures, legs with rancid fat, sending climbers sliding helplessly backward at dawn's first assault. Its true weapon was its people's unity. While castles fractured under the stress of siege, this village organized with eerie precision. A council of elders, mostly women, chosen for their knowledge of household resources, dictated rationing with unshakable fairness. Children as young as 7 were trained to spot enemy weaknesses, like the telltale slump of a hungry soldier's shoulders. Even the elderly contributed, stitching camouflage nets from unraveled burlap sacks to disguise movement along the walls. The siege dragged on for months, far beyond what logic dictated. When attackers finally breached the outer defenses, they found not a broken populace, but a maze of barricaded streets rigged with tripwires and deadfalls. By then, the Crusaders were exhausted, their ranks thinned by disease and desertion. The villagers' final stroke of genius, negotiating surrender on their own terms, securing safe passage rather than slaughter, a rarity in medieval warfare. Its legacy wasn't just in surviving, it was in rewriting the rules. Their tactics spread through whispered stories, inspiring other villages to resist rather than capitulate. The siege proved that walls didn't defend people, people defended walls. And sometimes, the fiercest warriors carried no swords at all, just an unbreakable will to see the next sunrise. The story of unfolds not as a tale of defiance, but as a chilling testament to the razor-thin line between resistance and annihilation. In July of 1209, as the Crusades swept through southern France, this prosperous trading town became the unwilling stage for one of medieval history's most infamous massacres. Unlike cunning survival, fate serves as a dark counterpoint, a community that gambled everything on standing firm, only to learn that some sieges end not in negotiation, but in fire and blood. What makes particularly haunting isn't just the scale of destruction, but the cruel irony of its defenses. The town boasted formidable Roman-era walls and a population swollen with refugees from nearby villages, perhaps 20,000 souls packed behind the ramparts. Their confidence seemed justified at first. When Crusader commander demanded the surrender of 220 suspected heretics, the response became legendary. "Kill them all. God will know his own." This wasn't just bravado, it reflected a fatal miscalculation. The townspeople believed their walls impenetrable, their unity unbreakable. They didn't account for the Crusaders' desperation to make an example. The breach came not through sophisticated siege engines, but through a teenager's tragic mistake. Historical accounts describe a group of young defenders taunting the besiegers from a poorly guarded postern gate. In their excitement, they failed to secure the portal properly, a lapse that allowed Crusaders to force their way inside. Within hours, the streets ran red. What followed wasn't battle but slaughter. Chroniclers of the time, though prone to exaggeration, describe 7,000 corpses in the church of Mary Magdalene alone, where civilians had sought sanctuary in vain. The town's very prosperity became its curse. Wealthy merchants' homes were torn apart stone by stone in search of hidden valuables, while the cathedral's lead roof was melted down for ammunition. Yet even in this horror, fragments of humanity survived. Some townspeople disguised themselves as dead among the piles of bodies, holding their breath until nightfall. A handful of children were reportedly smuggled out in wine barrels by a sympathetic merchant. Most poignant are the accounts of the town's Jews, who lived peacefully alongside Christians for generations. Many chose mass suicide in their synagogue rather than face conversion or the sword. These weren't just victims. They were people who'd calculated the limits of hope and made unbearable choices with stunning clarity. Legacy lingers not as a military lesson, but as a psychological one. The massacre shattered the myth of communal safety behind walls. Other villages, hearing the news, began surrendering without resistance, preferring humiliation to annihilation. Modern archaeologists still uncover layers of charred grain and melted jewelry in the soil, reminders of how quickly prosperity can turn to ash. But perhaps the most enduring lesson lies in the Crusaders' own words. When asked how to distinguish heretics from the faithful during the slaughter, reportedly shrugged, "Kill them all." In that moment, became more than a town. It became a warning about what happens when ideology erases humanity, and when the rules of survival collapse into chaos. Centuries may separate us from those besieged villages, but the threads of their ingenuity weave straight into the fabric of modern survival. When hurricane winds tear through coastal towns or wildfires force sudden evacuations, the same principles that kept medieval communities alive emerge in surprising ways. Take decentralized food storage. What villagers did by burying grain in secret pits, modern preachers practice by caching supplies in multiple locations. After hurricane, families who'd stashed bottled water and canned goods in attics, cars, and sheds fared better than those relying on centralized aid. The medieval logic holds: never let your survival depend on a single vulnerable point. Cooperation during crises follows the same ancient blueprint. Like villagers sharing rationed bread, communities after the 2010 Haiti earthquake formed impromptu networks to distribute aid when official channels failed. Neighbors became water carriers, nurses, and guards, mirroring the role sharing of besieged settlements. Even children found purpose. Just as medieval kids carried messages, modern youth in disaster zones often become tech-savvy lifelines, using social media to locate missing relatives. The unspoken rule remains unchanged. Catastrophe erases old hierarchies, rewarding those who pool skills rather than hoard them. Psychological resilience hasn't changed much either. Medieval villagers sang through the night to ward off despair. Today, disaster psychologists emphasize maintaining routines, whether it's a daily prayer or a neighborhood potluck, to anchor mental health. After the 2011 tsunami, Japanese survivors rebuilt not just houses but communal bathhouses, understanding that shared spaces heal as much as roofs protect. The principle is timeless. Hope isn't a luxury, it's sustenance. Yet the most striking parallel lies in deception's modern guise. Where villagers once staged fake feasts, today communities use strategic silence. During the Syrian civil war, activists avoided posting real-time photos of undamaged areas to prevent targeting. Cyber warfare employs similar misdirection, creating digital ghost towns to divert hackers, direct descendants of those straw dummies on medieval walls. Even the corporate world borrows these tactics. When a tech company's servers fail, PR teams might highlight unrelated positive news to mask vulnerability. The true lesson isn't just in mimicking tactics, but in understanding their root, the human ability to adapt systems to extreme pressure. Medieval villagers didn't have satellites or emergency broadcasts, but their layered defenses: physical, social, psychological form a prototype for modern disaster response. Their legacy whispers to us across the ages. Survival isn't about predicting every threat, but about cultivating the creativity to meet whatever comes. When the next crisis strikes, whether it's a pandemic or a power grid failure, the past offers this comfort. We've done this before. Not with the same tools, but with the same indomitable spirit. Archaeological digs across Europe are peeling back layers of soil to reveal the hidden genius of medieval villagers under siege. In the ruins of a Croatian fortress town, researchers stumbled upon something extraordinary: a network of narrow tunnels radiating outward from the village square like spokes on a wheel. These weren't escape routes dug in panic, but carefully engineered passages with ventilation shafts disguised as tree roots and exits concealed beneath boulders. The walls bore tool marks showing where generations had expanded the tunnels, turning them into an underground lifeline. Even more telling, the discovery of tiny footprints alongside adult ones, proving children played courier roles, slipping through passages too tight for armored pursuers. Buried food caches tell another story of desperation and foresight. At a site in southern France, archaeologists unearthed clay pots sealed with beeswax and buried 3 feet deep, each containing enough barley to feed a family for weeks. The real shock came when they analyzed the grain. Some seeds showed signs of deliberate scorching. Villagers had lightly burned portions of their precious stores before burial, a technique modern science confirms slows spoilage by killing bacteria. Nearby, they found hollowed-out logs filled with acorns, their tannins leached away by repeated soakings in running water, evidence of the biochemical knowledge passed through generations. The weapons these communities fashioned from scraps rewrite our understanding of medieval ingenuity. In an English dig, researchers uncovered arrowheads crafted from shattered pottery, their edges deliberately chipped into serrated patterns that would tear through cloth and flesh. Elsewhere, they found farming tools modified with brutal creativity, scythe blades welded at odd angles to create hooking weapons, pitchforks with fire-hardened tines. Most haunting are the stone blankets piles of fist-sized rocks arranged along former wall lines, ready to be dropped on climbers. These weren't improvised last stands, but systematic preparations. Perhaps the most poignant finds are the personal items hidden amid the defenses. A child's wooden doll stuffed with wool to muffle its rattle during hideouts. With makeshift repairs, its cracks sealed with tree resin and animal hair. These artifacts whisper of lives interrupted but not surrendered. Modern technology reveals even more. Soil analysis shows nutrient spikes where latrines were hastily dug, then covered with lime to mask their presence from enemies. Pollen studies prove villagers cultivated fast-growing greens, like spinach, in hidden courtyard gardens, long before official records credit such practices. These discoveries do more than confirm historical accounts, they humanize them. Where chronicles might dismiss a village's resistance in a single line, archaeology shows the months of secret digging, the nights spent rationing moldy grain, the children taught to tap coded messages on water pipes. Each layer of earth peeled back exposes not just survival tactics, but the unbreakable will of people who refuse to become footnotes in someone else's war. The true lesson isn't in how they hid or fought, but in how they left behind proof that even in darkness, humanity finds a way to endure. Hollywood would have us believe medieval villagers cowered helplessly behind their walls as flaming arrows rained from the sky. But the truth was far more fascinating and far less cinematic. One of the most persistent myths is that sieges were decided by brute force alone, when in reality, psychological warfare often played a bigger role than swords or battering rams. Villagers didn't just wait for rescue. They crafted intricate deceptions, from fake grain stores to staged displays of strength, proving that survival was as much about theater as it was about combat. Another exaggerated tale is the idea of widespread cannibalism during sieges. While desperate hunger did drive some to unthinkable extremes, archaeological evidence suggests most communities turned to every possible alternative first: boiling leather, grinding tree bark, even eating clay to fill their stomachs. The real horror wasn't rampant savagery, but the quiet, calculated choices families made to prioritize the young and able-bodied, sacrificing the elderly so others might live. These weren't scenes from a horror story. They were agonizing moral calculations made under unbearable pressure. Then there's the romanticized notion of the noble defender. Popular stories focus on brave knights or charismatic leaders, but village survival usually hinged on the collective wisdom of ordinary people, especially women. While men fought on the walls, women orchestrated food rationing, disguised escape routes, and even brewed makeshift medicines from garden herbs. Children, too, played vital roles, acting as lookouts or smuggling supplies through gaps too small for adults. The reality was a network of quiet, unsung heroes whose contributions rarely made it into songs or chronicles. Perhaps the most dangerous myth is the idea that besieged villages were cut off entirely. In truth, many maintained secret lines of communication with neighboring communities, using everything from trained dogs to hollowed-out logs as message tubes. There are accounts of villages receiving smuggled grain weeks into a siege, or coordinating surprise attacks with nearby allies. Isolation was often an illusion carefully cultivated to lure enemies into complacency. Another deception in a long game of survival chess. The folklore also glosses over the aftermath. Surviving a siege didn't mean riding off into the sunset. It meant rebuilding amidst trauma. Villagers faced years of starvation's lingering effects, stunted growth in children, weakened immunity, and psychological scars that outlasted physical wounds. Yet these communities didn't just recover, they adapted. Siege-resistant architecture emerged, like thicker cellar walls and hidden compartments. New crops were prioritized for their ability to grow quickly or be concealed. The real legacy of these villagers wasn't just endurance, but evolution, proof that even the darkest chapters could rewrite the future. So the next time you picture a medieval siege, forget the Hollywood. The truth is far more compelling. Ordinary people outsmarting overwhelming odds not through brute strength, but through ingenuity, unity, and an unshakable will to see tomorrow dawn. Their real story doesn't need embellishment, it simply needs to be heard. The legacy of medieval villagers isn't locked in dusty history books. It pulses through the way we respond to crises even today. Their struggles whisper to us across centuries, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit that thrives not in spite of adversity, but because of it. Consider how modern communities facing natural disasters instinctively recreate medieval survival tactics. Neighbors sharing generators during blackouts mirror villagers pooling candle wax, while urban gardeners cultivating rooftops echo those hidden siege gardens. The parallels aren't coincidental. They're proof that resilience follows universal blueprints. What makes these stories so gripping isn't just the ingenuity, it's the raw humanity. When we read about a mother grinding acorns to feed her children, or a blacksmith repurposing arrowheads into plowshares, we're not observing distant historical figures. We're recognizing ourselves. The same fierce love that compelled medieval parents to teach their children edible plants thrives in today's parents stockpiling insulin during hurricanes. That unshakable community bond that outlasted sieges. It's the same force that rebuilds towns after wildfires or floods. Time changes the threats, but not the fundamental choices between despair and determination. Archaeologists uncovering hidden grain pits or escape tunnels often describe a chilling familiarity. The careful spacing of food caches mirrors modern disaster preparedness guides, advising scattered supplies. Medieval villagers dispersing their valuables foreshadowed contemporary banks diversifying digital assets against cyberattacks. Even their psychological tactics, projecting false confidence during shortages, find echoes in wartime propaganda or corporate crisis management. The is clear. When survival hangs in the balance, human minds converge on similar strategies, regardless of era. Yet the most profound lesson isn't about tactics, it's about perspective. Those villagers could have defined themselves solely by what they lost: burned crops, stolen livestock, buried loved ones. Instead, they measured survival in what persisted: a shared song at dusk, a child's laughter echoing through tunnels, the stubborn green shoots of new barley piercing scorched earth. Their legacy challenges us to reframe our own struggles. Pandemic lockdowns, supply chain collapses, even personal tragedies, they all test the same age-old question: not whether we'll face darkness, but what light will kindle against it. The true power of these stories lies in their ordinariness. These weren't legendary warriors or monarchs. They were butchers and field hands. That's what makes their resilience so electrifying. It wasn't bestowed by birth or training, but forged in the crucible of necessity. When we recount how a village outlasted a siege by boiling leather or diverting a hidden spring, we're not just preserving history. We're stocking humanity's mental toolkit for future crises, ensuring the next generation inherits more than just survival skills. They inherit the unshakable certainty that even the longest night ends. Perhaps that's why medieval siege accounts so often mention small, defiant acts. A flower pot kept blooming on a shattered windowsill, a broken lute repaired to play lullabies. These weren't frivolities, they were declarations. Every siege eventually lifts, every winter thaws, and those who endure aren't just the strongest, but those who stubbornly nurture embers of hope in the wind. Their stories matter not because they're ancient, but because they're evergreen. However advanced we become, the most vital technology remains the human heart's capacity to keep beating and believing when all seems lost. The villagers who endured these sieges weren't mythical heroes or battle-hardened warriors. They were mothers grinding acorns into flour by candlelight, fathers teaching children to spot edible weeds, grandparents whispering stories to drown out the sound of enemy drums. Their greatest weapon wasn't steel, but something far more enduring: the refusal to let despair have the final word. What makes their legacy so powerful isn't just that they survived, but how they did it, transforming every scrap, every shadow, every moment of quiet into a tool for outlasting the storm. Consider the sheer audacity of their resilience. A single medieval villager might spend their entire life within a few miles of their birthplace, yet when crisis came, they thought like generals. They turned chicken coops into lookout posts, fishing nets into tripwires, even their own silence into a weapon against invaders. But what's truly humbling is how their ingenuity was never about personal glory. It was always for the collective. The blacksmith who melted arrowheads into plowshares didn't do it for praise. He did it so the children next door could eat come spring. That selflessness is their real gift to history. Their stories also shatter the myth that survival is a solo endeavor. Time and again, these villagers proved that unity is the ultimate lifeline. When the walls trembled, it wasn't the strongest individual who saved the day. It was the widow who remembered where the wild onions grew, the shepherd who noticed enemy movements in his flock's behavior, the children who carried messages through tunnels too narrow for adults. Modern disaster science confirms what they knew instinctively: communities that coordinate survive. From earthquake drills to pandemic mutual aid networks, we're still using their playbook. Perhaps the most poignant lesson lies in how they measured victory. Success wasn't defeating the enemy army, it was seeing the next sunrise. Not grand triumphs, but small, stubborn acts of preservation. Saving a single fruit tree's seeds, hiding a family Bible beneath floorboards, humming a lullaby to a frightened child. Their resilience wasn't flashy, it was granular, woven into everyday choices. That's why their legacy endures. Whether facing a medieval siege or a modern crisis, the principle remains. Survival isn't about dramatic last stands. It's about the quiet, daily decision to keep going. As the smoke cleared and the siege lifted, these villagers did something remarkable. They replanted. They rebuilt. Not as if nothing had happened, but with hard-won wisdom etched into every stone. They thickened walls where breaches had occurred, buried caches deeper, taught there to recognize the first distant glint of armor. Trauma didn't vanish, but it became fertilizer for growth. That's the final, vital lesson. Resilience isn't just enduring, it's adapting. So the next time you face what feels like an impossible challenge, remember the medieval villagers, not as distant figures in a history book, but as kin in spirit. Their blood runs in our veins, their ingenuity sparks in our creativity, their unbroken will whispers in our darkest hours. They remind us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, not because they're special, but because they had no other choice. And that's the most empowering truth of all. If these stories of grit and ingenuity resonated with you, consider passing them along. Hit like if you're amazed by what humans can endure, subscribe for more hidden histories, and drop a comment below. Maybe share which survival tactic stunned you the most. After all, the best way to honor these unsung heroes is to keep their lessons alive.